Welcome to Serial Killer Files. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most chilling questions that haunts criminal psychology. How are serial killers made? What transforms an innocent child into someone capable of the most heinous crimes imaginable? Over the next hour, we'll journey through the disturbing childhoods of some of America's most notorious killers. Fair warning, this episode contains graphic content that may be disturbing to some listeners. But understanding these origins isn't about sympathy. It's about prevention, recognition, and perhaps most importantly, breaking the cycles that create monsters. Imagine trying to unravel a puzzle where the pieces are dark, broken, and scattered across decades of pain, neglect, and trauma. The roots of serial killers are tangled in complex psychological, environmental, and sometimes biological factors, none of which offer easy answers. But by looking closely at the lives behind the headlines, we might begin to understand what really drives the darkness. This is the story of the roots of serial killers. Let's start with what might be the most shocking case of maternal influence gone wrong. Henry Lee Lucas, born in 1937 in the poverty-stricken hills of Blacksburg, Virginia. If you think you've heard terrible childhood stories before, prepare yourself. Henry's mother, Viola Lucas, was a prostitute who turned their 3-room dirt floor cabin into her workplace. But here's where it gets truly horrific. She would force young Henry and his disabled father to watch her have sex with clients. If they refused or looked away, she'd beat them with a club. Imagine being a child, trapped in this nightmare with nowhere to escape. One of Henry's most vivid early memories? His mother shooting a client in the leg after sex, splattering young Henry with the man's blood. This moment seemed to spark something dark in the boy's mind, a fascination with blood and its connection to sex that would define his future crimes. But Viola's cruelty didn't stop there. She would beat Henry with whatever object she could find, forbidding him to cry, constantly telling him he was inherently evil and destined to die in prison. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. The only source of love in Henry's life was a pet mule. When Viola discovered this small ray of happiness, she shot the animal dead in front of him, then beat him for the cost of removing the carcass. The physical abuse was equally devastating. When Henry was slow to collect wood for the stove, his mother struck him with a piece of lumber so hard he was unconscious for 3 days before anyone bothered taking him to a hospital. After this incident, he suffered frequent dizziness, blackouts, and feelings of weightlessness, likely brain damage that would affect him for life. And if that wasn't enough psychological warfare, on his first day of school, Viola sent Henry dressed as a girl, complete with curled hair and a dress. This emasculation tactic, interestingly, appears in the histories of at least 7 male serial killers, including Charles Manson. Now you might think Lucas was exaggerating these stories for sympathy, but here's the chilling truth. Every detail has been independently verified by neighbors and former teachers. As Lucas himself said, "They ain't got, I don't think, a human being alive that can say he had the childhood I had." Moving from maternal abuse to paternal failure, let's examine how absent or violent fathers create voids that get filled with darkness. Ted Bundy's story begins with a lie that would haunt his entire existence. Born in 1946 to unwed mother Louise, Ted spent his early years believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. When Louise finally took him away from Philadelphia to Tacoma, Washington, 4-year-old Teddy couldn't understand why he had to leave his beloved grandfather Cowell. In Tacoma, Louise met John Culpepper Bundy, Johnny, a gentle, soft-spoken man who worked as a cook at a Veterans Administration hospital. While Johnny was kind-hearted and accepted both Louise and her son unconditionally, Young Ted saw him as an intrusion. Ted's aspirations were grand, and Johnny's modest horizons frustrated the ambitious boy. The tension came to a head in moments like the infamous Sears parking lot incident, where Ted embarrassed himself publicly, later attributing these episodes to his jealousy and fear of further upheaval. When Louise gave birth to daughter Linda in 1952, Ted was confused and resentful, somehow blaming Johnny for causing his mother suffering. But here's what's fascinating. Ted found a father figure in Uncle Jack Cowell, a refined music professor at the College of Puget Sound. Jack's elegant piano playing and classical music taste captivated Ted, who desperately wanted to emulate this sophistication. This early attraction to refinement and culture would later manifest in Ted's ability to charm victims with his educated, well-mannered facade. The Bundy case shows us how identity confusion and the search for an idealized father figure can create a fractured psyche. Ted's teacher, Mrs. Oyster, noted his self-assurance and articulation in first grade, but when she left on maternity leave, it marked another unsettling transition for a boy already struggling with abandonment issues. Now let's examine how domestic violence creates killers through the story of John Wayne Gacy Jr. When John was just 2 years old, his world was already soaked in terror and blood. Picture this scene. Marion Gacy has just returned from the hospital with 3-week-old twin daughters when her husband, Gacy Sr., comes home in a rage. He physically assaults Marion, knocking out several of her teeth, while 2-year-old John Jr. and his older sister scream in terror. When Marion flees to the street, Gacy Sr. follows, continuing to beat her until she's knocked to the sidewalk. Only police intervention stops the assault. As John Jr. grew, he often tried to protect his mother during these violent episodes. But his father's response, calling him a mama's boy and a sissy for showing compassion. Despite the abuse, the children loved their father, a psychological complexity that would haunt John throughout his life. Family dinners became exercises in fear as the children anxiously waited for their father's nightly drunken rants in the basement to end. But the violence wasn't just physical. When Marion discovered a bag of her underwear beneath the porch where John played, he had developed a fascination with silk and nylon textures. His humiliation was complete. According to psychiatric interviews, his mother made him wear her underwear as punishment, after which his father whipped him with a leather strap. The sexual abuse began early, too. Between ages 6 and 10, a teenage daughter of his mother's friend inappropriately touched him. At 8 or 9, he recalled wrestling with a contractor who restrained him in sexually suggestive positions. Each incident was another brick in the wall of his developing psychopathy. John's mother, Marion, later told psychiatrists that if his father had known about his son's homosexuality, it could have been deadly. The fear of his father's reaction would drive John's later desperate attempts to appear normal. The clown performances, the community involvement, the marriage, all while bodies accumulated beneath his house. Sometimes the most dangerous influence isn't a parent. It's the person a child chooses as their hero. Richard Ramirez's transformation from abused child to Night Stalker began when he found a mentor in his older cousin Miguel, known as Mike. Richard's father, Julian Tapia Ramirez, was brutally abusive, delivering harsh beatings despite young Richard's pleas for mercy. To escape this violence, Richard would sometimes sleep in the local cemetery, an early exposure to death that many believe sparked his later interest in Satanism. But it was cousin Mike who would truly mold Richard's dark destiny. Mike was a decorated Army Green Beret who served in Vietnam, and he became Richard's hero. But Mike's war stories weren't typical tales of heroism. Instead, he regaled 11-year-old Richard with graphic accounts of rape and murder, showing disturbing photographs of Vietnamese women he had sexually assaulted. In one particularly horrifying image, Mike posed with the severed head of a woman he claimed to have killed. While smoking marijuana and listening to these gruesome tales, Richard absorbed more than just stories. He was receiving an education in violence. Mike taught him how to kill and move without being detected, skills that would later make Richard one of California's most elusive killers. The mentorship reached its climax in 1973, when Richard witnessed Mike shoot and kill his wife. Mike was found not guilty by reason of insanity, but was released just 4 years later, continuing to influence Richard's development during crucial teenage years. This case illustrates how children desperately seeking escape from abuse can fall under the influence of seemingly glamorous figures who offer an alternative to their pain. Richard took Mike's lessons to heart, eventually becoming one of America's most notorious serial killers, a title he wore with pride until his death. Some serial killers are defined by their specific obsessions, and Jerry Brudos presents a textbook case of how childhood humiliation can create deadly fetishes. Born in South Dakota in 1939, Jerome Henry Brudos discovered a pair of high heels at a local dump when he was young. This innocent find would set the course for his entire criminal career. When Jerry brought the shoes home, his controlling mother's reaction was swift and brutal. She confiscated and burned them. By first grade, Jerry was stealing shoes from his sister, and his mother's emotional abuse intensified. She openly favored his older brother, treating Jerry as a disappointment and shaming him especially when he showed interest in anything feminine. This wasn't just preference. It was systematic psychological warfare. Jerry's mother belittled him constantly, her harsh discipline and rejection of his behaviors creating deep resentment and emotional isolation. As a teenager in Oregon, Jerry expanded his activities to burglary, stealing shoes from homes and taking women's undergarments from clotheslines. The escalation was predictable. In 1956, at 17, Brudos assaulted a girl who rejected his inappropriate advances, leading to court-ordered therapy that proved ineffective. His pattern emerged, stalking women until he had an opportunity to strike, leaving them unconscious while he stole their shoes. Even marriage couldn't contain his obsessions. His wife discovered photos of Jerry dressed as a woman and found what he claimed was a plastic breast paperweight. It was actually a preserved hunting trophy from one of his victims. She didn't find the other photos of Jerry posing with his victims' bodies, dressing them in lingerie like macabre dolls. The fetish had completely consumed his humanity. When he claimed his final victim, 22-year-old Linda Salih, her body was recovered weighted down with a car transmission. Another victim, Karen Sprinker, was found wearing a bra several sizes too large to hide the fact that Jerry had removed her breasts as trophies. Jerry's case shows how maternal rejection and humiliation around natural childhood curiosity can create deadly obsessions that ultimately consume everything in their path. Some killers emerge from such comprehensive trauma that their transformation seems inevitable. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, represents the perfect storm of childhood factors that create a monster. Ridgway struggled academically from the start, a slow learner and poor reader who felt stupid and inadequate. But his real problems went much deeper. He engaged in arson, bribed a child to let him fondle her genitals, committed property crimes, and murdered a cat by suffocation. These are the classic warning signs criminologists look for, and Gary displayed them all. His relationship with his mother created a psychological powder keg. He was sexually attracted to her while simultaneously harboring violent fantasies about her. His bedwetting persisted into his early teens, and he retained vivid memories of his mother washing his genitals, imagery that would later manifest in fantasies of showering with prostitutes. But alongside these sexual feelings came equally powerful violent impulses. Gary fantasized about mutilating, killing, or burning his mother. He described thoughts of stabbing her in the chest or heart, cutting her face and chest. When questioned by police, he tried to minimize these fantasies, calling them fleeting whims, as if imagining slicing your mother with a knife is somehow normal. Even in elementary school, Gary exhibited what he later called patrolling behavior. He would follow girls home, sexually aroused, viewing them as targets while discovering their residences. This early predatory behavior was a clear precursor to his later crimes. In the late 1960s, Gary attempted to force himself on a young woman he'd picked up at Seattle Center. He pulled off the road, demanded sex, and fondled her breasts before surprisingly allowing her to leave. This moment of restraint seems almost merciful compared to his later actions, but it perfectly demonstrates the escalating pattern of control and violence that would define his career as one of America's most prolific serial killers. Our final case study takes us to rural England and Fred West, whose childhood story is so shrouded in conflicting claims that separating fact from fiction becomes nearly impossible. Born in 1941 in Herefordshire Parish, Fred was raised in what appeared to be a large, tightly knit farming family. Fred held a particularly close bond with his mother, Daisy, who clearly favored him, but her fondness manifested as overbearing protectiveness. She forbade him from dating until he was 21, creating an unhealthy codependency. Meanwhile, his relationship with Father Walter was characterized by greater leniency, though the true nature of Walter's influence remains debatable. Here's where Fred's story becomes particularly disturbing, though we must note these claims lack corroborating evidence. During police interrogations after his arrest, Fred attributed his actions to his childhood experiences, alleging that incest was normalized in the West household. He claimed both parents engaged in sexual relations with their children, asserting his first sexual encounter was with his mother at age 12. Fred also claimed his father practiced bestiality and exposed him to such acts, supposedly teaching him that he could do anything he wished as long as he didn't get caught. These allegations have been met with skepticism due to lack of evidence, but they contribute to understanding how Fred might have justified his later horrific crimes. The challenge with Fred West's case is that he was a master manipulator who spun webs of conflicting narratives during interrogation. Various media outlets sensationalized his shocking allegations, but others highlighted the impossibility of verifying these claims. What we do know is that something in Fred's development created a monster capable of unimaginable crimes. This case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous environments are those that appear normal from the outside, where secrets fester behind closed doors and children learn that reality itself cannot be trusted. Now that we've journeyed through these 7 case studies, certain patterns emerge that are impossible to ignore. Each of these future killers experienced specific types of trauma that seem to activate particular psychological triggers. First, there's the abandonment and identity confusion we saw with Ted Bundy, the lies about his parentage, the constant relocations, the search for an idealized father figure. This creates individuals who struggle with authentic connection and develop elaborate facades to hide their inner emptiness. Second, we see domestic violence and parental abuse in cases like Gacy and Ramirez. When home becomes a war zone, children learn that violence is how problems are solved and power is maintained. They internalize the roles of both victim and perpetrator, often switching between them throughout their lives. Third, there's the sexual abuse and inappropriate exposure we found in multiple cases. Gacy, Lucas, and West all experienced early sexual trauma that warped their understanding of intimacy and power. This creates individuals who see sex as a weapon rather than an expression of love. Fourth, maternal rejection and humiliation, as seen with Brudos and Lucas, can create obsessions and resentments that grow stronger over time. When the person who should provide unconditional love instead becomes a source of shame, children learn to hate the very concept of vulnerability. Fifth, we see the importance of role models in shaping behavior. Richard Ramirez's transformation under his cousin Mike's influence shows how children desperately seeking alternatives to their pain can fall under the sway of glamorous but destructive figures. Finally, there's the accumulation effect. Gary Ridgway's case shows how multiple trauma types can create a perfect storm of psychological damage that seems almost inevitable to result in violence. But here's the crucial point. Millions of children experience trauma without becoming killers. What separates those who heal from those who harm seems to be a combination of factors. The severity and duration of trauma, the complete absence of positive influences, genetic predispositions we're only beginning to understand, and perhaps most importantly, the presence or absence of intervention at crucial developmental moments. As we conclude this disturbing journey through the origins of evil, it's important to remember why we take these deep dives into darkness. Understanding how monsters are made isn't about excusing their crimes or generating sympathy for killers. It's about prevention. Every teacher who notices a child's disturbing drawings, every neighbor who reports suspected abuse, every social worker who follows up on concerning signs, these are the real heroes in preventing future tragedies. Because while we can't change the past that created these monsters, we can absolutely change the future by recognizing and interrupting these patterns before they reach their deadly conclusion. The serial killers described in today's episode, little Ted Bundy searching for a father figure, young John Wayne Gacy trying to protect his mother, Richard Ramirez sleeping in cemeteries to escape his father's fists. They were all victims before they became victimizers. The tragedy is that in most cases, the warning signs were there, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Mental health resources, child protective services, school counseling programs, community intervention initiatives. These aren't just social services, they're monster prevention programs. Every child saved from severe trauma, every cycle of abuse interrupted, every disturbed adolescent connected with proper help. These actions literally save lives, both of potential victims and potential perpetrators. The darkness we've explored today is real, and it's creating new victims right now in homes across the world. But knowledge is power, and understanding these patterns gives us the tools to recognize and interrupt them. Want to hear more about how the dark childhoods of other infamous serial killers like Aileen Wuornos, Elizabeth Bathory, Peter Curtin, Ed Kemper, and more? Then download the Skoob app now to unlock the full stories and discover the moments that changed everything when one decision to face the truth made all the difference. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey into roots of serial killers. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and remember, the best way to honor the victims of these crimes is to prevent future ones from ever occurring.